Howdy, folks. Thanks for joining the Coffee Technicians Guild Ask the Expert, episode 10, Chlorides, with Scott Manley of La Marzocco. Scott's going to walk us through understanding chlorides, what they are, what they do to coffee and coffee equipment, and how to test for them and understand the results. There'll be plenty of time for questions after Scott's presentation, so please feel free to ask away in the questions box you see on there on the side. If we aren't able to answer a question by the end of the session, we'll make sure to address them on our social media platforms as soon as we can. A quick reminder, this Ask the Expert series is for everyone. So please join us every Friday at this time, whatever that time may be for you. Next week, we'll be discussing cleaning your equipment with Maria Cleveland from Ernex Brands, and a full schedule is available on the CTG website. But now I'm going to hand things over to Scott. Scott, if you could introduce yourself real quick for any first timers and then take it away.
Thanks, Clinton. Thank you. So, all right, not working. There we go. Got a slide deck here I'm trying to work through. So, hey, everybody, my name is Scott Manley. I am the Technical Support Supervisor and Water Quality Specialist for La Marzocco USA. So I manage or supervise a call center with my colleagues to help support our customers and technicians out in the field. And I also do water testing, analysis, and kind of, assist people when they get into, issues with their water. So I would like to welcome you all to this. I'd really like to thank Highland and Clinton and the SCA for making this series available to everybody and really putting the resources behind it to get us together, even in this time where we can't be together. So I think that's really important. So just to get this out of the way, and if you noticed on the initial slide deck title card there that I crossed out chloramine. So just an apology, if you were here because you wanted to hear about chlorides and chloramine, we're not going to talk about chloramine at this time. They sound alike, and yeah, they're both, you can say made from chlorine, but they're really two different things, and we address them differently. The testing is different, and how you're going to remediate for both of those things is going to be very different. And so it's really something to cover in a separate topic on disinfectants in water. So, but real quickly, chloramine is a combination of ammonia and chlorine, and it's a disinfectant like chlorine. Unlike straight chlorine, which dissipates fairly quickly when exposed to air, chloramine remains in water longer. So it works better as a disinfectant, and you're going to find a lot of municipalities have either switched to or using chloramines in combination with chlorine, depending on where it is in their distribution system, to see that you get sanitized or safe water to drink. Like I said, it's different than chlorides, has a different effect on our coffee, has a different, effect on our equipment, and how we test for and deal with that is really different than chlorides. But don't worry, we're going to cover this later, probably in another episode down the line, and we'll get to that. So this is a story about chlorides. So we're going to cover really quickly, what are chlorides? Well, chloride is an anion, or an ion of the anion chlorine, which is formed when the element chlorine gains an electron, or when a compound, such as hydrogen chloride, is dissolved in water or other polar solvents. Generally speaking, we're not dumping a bunch of hydrogen chloride in the water anywhere. We're generally gaining chloride in our water from a number of sources, which I'll cover in just a moment. Chloride is a solid. This is important to note between chlorine, which is a halogen gas, and chloride, which becomes a solid when it gains an electron. Furthermore, chloride is a corrosion factor or vector in various metals in what we use to brew coffee equipment with: stainless steel, copper, and brass. Chloride doesn't attack these metals the same way and in the same exact set of parameters or factors, but they all have some vulnerability to that. So it's important that we identify them. Another thing to note about chlorides, in low concentrations, it actually improves the palatability of water. And you can test this by getting some distilled water or bottled distilled water or really pure RO water. Drink some of that and compare it to your normal tap water. And you may notice it tastes a little bit flat. If you want to make it taste better, just take a pinch of salt, dissolve that into your glass of water, and you will stir it up. And you'll notice it actually will taste a little bit sweet or slightly sweet or better. And that's actually the chlorides. That's our perception of chlorides in water in very low concentrations. I've also heard from people who do a lot of roasting and cupping that chlorides will mask some brewing defects in water. So if you're cupping to really high or medium high chloride concentration, it's going to have somewhat of an effect on extraction, but the chloride present in the water will have subjectively some effect on how you perceive that roast. So something to keep note there for roasters as well as cafes. And I mention this only because when you're roasting or you're roasting and cupping in the lab, you're usually, in a cupping vessel or something that isn't vulnerable to chloride, so you're probably not taking that into account. So just something to keep in mind, and something that I've encountered with roasters and cafes before, just that disconnect. Where you're likely to find water that has high chloride concentrations that you might be concerned about, that's generally going to be in coastal areas in North America, probably coastal areas in other parts of the world too, although I'm mostly familiar with the US. And then also in the US, the upper Midwest, and that's mostly due to salting of roads, and you cover that in just a moment. So I kind of spoke to this a moment ago, but how do chlorides get into your drinking water? Well, there's three primary ways. Like I said, if you're coastal, it's more likely that you're going to have some chloride intrusion into your water table. Mostly in the Northeast and in Southern California and coastal areas, those are going to be your principal hotspots. So places, but there's some exception to that. Here in Washington State, in Seattle, we get most of our water from rainwater collection and rivers coming down out of the mountains. We don't pull water out of the Puget Sound or the Pacific Ocean. So by and large, we have never had a chloride problem here or any sort of water-related equipment problem here in the Seattle area. This is also true for Portland, Oregon. Portland has a very similar water strategy to Seattle. And then the last one that's also an even bigger market would be New York City proper, Manhattan, some of the boroughs. All of their water comes down from Catskills, so in gigantic pipes. So those are a couple of exceptions to those rules as far as coastal communities with chloride intrusion. Places that are particular hotspots are going to be like Boston, Washington, D.C., parts of New Jersey, Philadelphia, a few places in kind of the north, Carolinas, a little bit of Georgia, though not as much experience there, and Florida, because basically Florida is surrounded by the ocean. So those are areas where you're going to, and Southern California, areas where they're either pulling some water out of the ocean, or the groundwater that they're using has some interaction with seawater. So it's going to pick up some of those chlorides. One thing to note about chlorides, they aren't harmful to humans. So if you're wondering why your local municipality is not doing something to remediate this, it's because it's not really necessary. They're filtering or making sure water's sanitary and safe for you to drink, not necessarily safe to put into a sanitized or sanitary boiler. Going on from there, the upper Midwest, boy, they get a lot of cold weather and icy roads, and they really like their road salt. And unfortunately, when you spread salt all over the road, it goes somewhere, usually down into the ground and then into the water table, and it tends to concentrate there. And so that's an area you get into Wisconsin, Minnesota, parts of Illinois. You're going to see increased concentrations, sometimes substantially, in the chloride concentration of your groundwater. So another area to keep note of. And then there's a few pockets throughout the United States. The other source that we see or have seen chloride concentrations in product water for filtering, it comes from certain remineralization products. Because it's easier to reintroduce calcium into water as calcium carbonate. I'm sorry, calcium chloride. It was pretty popular for a time, and still is with some manufacturers, to use calcium chloride as a remineralization substitute for calcium carbonate. Here's a picture of a slide from the last water presentation I did on water hardness, and where we talked about the differences between temporary hardness and permanent hardness. Temporary hardness tends to be that thing that is just a nuisance for the most part, or even more of a nuisance. It can be a lot of work to remove, but it doesn't really or generally damage your equipment permanently. So that's generally concentrations of calcium carbonate, things that are going to come out of solution at brewing temperatures or boiler temperatures and scale up the boiler. Several manufacturers discovered that, if you introduce calcium chloride into water, you can increase your water hardness for brewing, maybe get a better extraction, and it's not going to precipitate out as hard scale in your boiler. That sounds like a win-win, except for the fact that this calcium is bound with chloride, and when it goes into solution, obviously it's going to turn into calcium and free chloride in water, and then it's going to potentially or possibly attack your boiler. And the result will be this rusting of your stainless steels and corrosion of copper. So the question from there is, so we've identified what chloride is and where you're going to likely find it. So at what concentration should I be concerned? Like, do I have chloride or not? So the SCA, many manufacturers, set water standards for their equipment. So I would recommend, if you aren't familiar with the SCA's water quality handbook, go online and check that out, or talk to your guild representative or somebody you know in the SCA. Contact the SCA about getting access to that. If it's not, I think it's publicly available, but I may have to clear that up in the questions. Generally, the number that you're looking for, or the chloride concentration that you're going to be concerned with, depending on whose standard you're using, is going to be anywhere from 0 to 50 parts per million. La Marzocco's water quality specification states a maximum of 30 parts per million. So that gives you a frame of reference for a fairly common manufacturer out there. We've got gear pretty much everywhere, and we do have, a fair amount of experience with testing water in most of the markets in North America, and in some in Canada now. So to add to that, to protect against corrosion, the alkalinity concentration should be at least 4 times the chloride concentration if no remediation is employed. What that means is, and here's an example in math, if you had chloride number of 50 parts per million, and you wanted to be fairly certain that it was not going to attack your metal, you would need to maintain an alkalinity level of at least 200 parts per million, which means your total TDS at that point, not accounting for anything else that may be in your water, you probably would have something else in your water, would be at least 250 parts per million. That's just an example. That's just a kind of a way to show you the ratios between those two. Why is that? Well, alkalinity is your buffer. What it does is it keeps your pH from shifting around, and water does like to move around pH. Why that's important in chloride concentration? Well, chloride tends to attack stainless steel and metals, stainless steel in particular, at low pH, at 6 pH or below. So generally, if the pH can't shift down, the chloride probably or possibly won't attack the metal. But the flip side of that is you've got water with very high TDS and very high alkalinity that's probably going to taste somewhat chalky and isn't going to be terribly great for extraction. So unfortunately, most of the time, you're not going to get away with leaving an excess of chloride in your water, given that you got to have this other alkalinity. So testing. So, hey, the important part for most technicians is going to be, how do I know if I have chlorides? We know what we're looking for. We know what we probably need to remediate, but how do I know that's what I need to do? And for some of you, you may already know that based upon your the geography or wherever you're located. But for others, it may be that the water varies between the different markets that you serve. It might be, you know, something you haven't done before. So we're going to talk about testing here. And it's going to be important for those people, especially in markets where you can't necessarily assume that you don't have chlorides. You know, I talked about places like Boston and Philadelphia, and Florida and Los Angeles. And those are areas where we know for certain there's a chloride problem. I mean, you should test for it still, but you should basically assume that you have chlorides in your water in excess of the allowable limit for your equipment or for coffee brewing. For other areas, though, it can vary, mostly because local municipalities may use different sources of water at either different times of the year or even, you know, different times of the month. So, testing. Here are some methods for determining chloride concentration in your water, and I'm going to go through them in kind of order of least expensive, most accessible, to more expensive and maybe less accessible, depending on where you're at. The first and most common way for testing for an easiest way for a technician or a cafe or a roaster to detect for chlorides in your water is going to be dip strips. The only one out there really worth looking at is the Quantab titrator strips. And the picture I have here that you see on the screen, sorry, I'm shaking the screen. Quantab isn't a brand per se. It's a specific product that's marketed by a number of manufacturers. I've actually never purchased ETS, and I've never seen this before. I just grabbed this off the internet because the markings on the box are really clear. But they all are in the same range, whether you buy it from Hawk or ITS or ETS, they're all going to be basically the same product. Like any other dip strip, though, it has certain time requirements to it, meaning there's a certain period of time in which you need to, you know, activate the titrant within that dip strip, and then you have a period of time after that in which you're going to have to read the result and interpret it. It is very time-based. So that's something to keep in mind, that you kind of have to block out that minute or two from distraction while you're in the cafe to pay attention to this, and you can't really answer questions. Couple of things, they're easy, convenient to use, fairly accurate. I've done water testing with customers with the Quantab titrator strips, and then tested the same water in our water lab to verify those results, and also used a third-party lab to verify the results as well. And basically, we all came up with about the same accuracy. Not necessarily the same precision, but the same accuracy. Speaking to accuracy and precision, and looking at the picture of this displayed dip strip, you can see that on the bottle, the titration range is between 30 and 600 parts per million. So that's a pretty huge range. However, the gradient displayed on the strip goes between 1 and basically 9 or 10. So the gradient, the resolution that you're going to get from this isn't terribly great. It almost works like a go, no-go type of scenario, because you really can't see too much below 30 or anything below 30 at all. And the range between 30 and 600 is, you know, the gradient is really, you know, you can't really see very much there. It's still useful though. And couple of things, they're relatively expensive. It's about $1.50 per test, so that bottle of 50 there is probably like $60, $70. But on the upside of that, it's convenient. You can throw it into your tool bag. It's in a plastic container. It's not really going to get damaged. You just got to avoid it getting to any moisture in there. So one last thing, it is colorimetric, or didn't spell that right, but may not work if you have color blindness, or you know, can't see or perceive color changes very well. I know that these Quantab kits switch between kind of a orangish color to kind of a light yellow, and sometimes it can be hard to see depending on the light that you're in. Next, we have manual titration. With titration, you're going to take some water in solution, you're going to mix some reagents into it, and add titrant in drops in order to achieve a stable end reaction, unstable reaction. You're going to get better precision because you're actually controlling the amount of titrant going in drops, which is going to be calculated out to some parts per million number. Generally, the resolution is between 15 and 20 parts per million. So it's a little better than the Quantab, but it's not going to give you some really fine number. The cost per test can be slightly lower than the Quantab. I want to put it at around $1 for reagents, depending on how much chloride you're testing for and how much titrant you have to add, of course. It ends in a stable reaction, which is really nice. So the time-based thing kind of is a little lessened in this, meaning that, if your color changes in your solution at 5 drops and you set the container on the counter and you get distracted, you're going to come back and that color change is going to should be the same. It should, 5 is 5 at that point. It's not going to continue to change color or, so there's that. A couple of cons, it's easy to mess up, honestly. When you're in a cafe situation, there's a lot of distraction. People are asking you to move sometimes if you're taking up some counter space or their back room or at their desk or wherever you are. I found that to be the case. And sometimes you mess up and you drop 2 drops instead of 1 on accident. And so was it the first drop that caused the reaction and the color change that I'm looking for? Was it the second drop? Do I got to do this all over again? So that's something that can happen. It can be messy. The coloring reagents that you're going to add to solution, they can stain your clothing and sometimes stain countertops. So you want to make sure to put a towel down if you're doing it on a countertop, or use a stainless steel countertop if one's available. And again, it's colorimetric, so this is a challenge. So if you're trying to look for a change between colors, and generally speaking, that color change is going to be between like light red and purple, it may not be really easy or purple and blue or whatever. It may be hard to perceive, even if you're not colorblind. Depending on how the light's hitting it, it sometimes is difficult. So I'll let you know about, that's something to be aware of. So, and probably the last tool that you would use, and I'm speaking mostly the things in the field here, because you could go spend thousands of dollars on lab testing equipment, but most of us aren't going to do that. But a product that I have used is Hardness checkers. These are small devices. This one's actually about the size of a Zippo lighter, maybe a little bit bigger than Zippo. If you flip the top off, you've got a little cuvette inside where you add some water to it, add some reagent. There is a time factor involved, where you got to let it sit and shake it up and make sure it's all mixed. And then you drop it in the checker, close the lid, press a button, and what it's doing is it's passing a light source through that cuvette, and it's measuring the intensity of the light pass through it, the transmission of light through it, and then measuring it. And then it gives you back a number that's fairly accurate. That you can see a certain amount of pretty good precision out of it. There is a caveat though to this checker that I found out, and that is that it only reads a range between 0 and 20 parts per million on the high side, which is virtually useless for our purposes. However, there's a way around this, and that's called dilution. Basically, you would bring this checker, and you'd also bring a small bottle of distilled water with you, and you would change the dilution ratio between your source water that you're testing and some distilled water, and then you're just going to multiply out your result at the end to get an accurate number. And I've done this hundreds of times, and it works. So even though the range of the equipment is only, or the checker is only 0 to 20, you actually, with dilution, depending on where you go from 1 to 10 or 10 to 1, you can get an accurate number up to read somewhere in the range of close to 200 parts per million chloride if you need to. So it's a fairly low cost per test because you're adding the same amount of reagent every single time, regardless of your dilution, because it's the same volume of water, unlike titration, where you may have to add more or less titrant to get a result. It does lower the cost a little bit, so it's probably somewhat slightly below titration when averaged. The color thing isn't an issue, even though it is a colorimetric system. It has a device that takes care of that for you. Also, because it's enclosed and it's using its own light source and not the ambient light around you, there you don't have to worry about that sort of interference, which sometimes comes in. I've actually had that happen a few times in dark cafes with really moody lighting, and then somebody opens up the door and changes the light and I'm not paying attention with titration. So upfront costs of metering devices can be, you've got to pay for the device. The checkers are really pretty inexpensive. I think these are like $50, which isn't too bad. A little bit of added complexity. Now you got this device you got to keep track of and some different reagents and cuvettes. So it's more tools to carry, and I understand what that's like. I mean, I think by the time I left the field, I was carrying like 3 toolboxes. I wasn't walking into the store with 3 toolboxes every time, but they were in my truck. I had one for electrical and one for water testing, my regular tools for my espresso machines, and then some plumbing tools, because I did a lot of that too. One last thing that I will add about testing or quantifying chloride concentrations in water, and this is from a Slack post that I wrote November 26, 2019, that a lot of people found helpful. And the gist of it is this, is that you can use a little bit of chemistry knowledge and some math and available information to determine or get a read on what's your chloride concentration in your local water. So this deals with consumer confidence reports, which is a mandatory water quality report for public drinking water systems throughout the United States. It's mandated by the EPA. Now, it doesn't mandate that you report on chloride concentrations. It actually only mandates you report on potentially 25 different things in your water that can be a source of contamination for human consumption. However, most municipalities do a pretty good job of reporting these things annually, and sometimes more often than that. The annual report also may be an average or a range of tests done throughout the year. And something to take note about consumer confidence reports, even though your municipality may have very limited information on their public report, the underlying testing that was used to generate the public report probably has more information, and that information usually can be obtained by the local water department if you ask really nicely. So how that pertains to chloride concentration? Well, many municipalities, while they don't report chlorides, may report the sodium concentration of water. And this is important because sodium chloride is the most common naturally occurring chloride compound in water. So where I found this to be helpful is certain parts of California and definitely in Florida, they all tend to report their sodium concentrations in water. They don't report the chloride, but they report the sodium. And so if you know this, and you can also confirm that there's no sodium hydroxide, which is used to raise pH in water, you can then take that sodium number and calculate out approximately with a fair degree of certainty what your average chloride concentration in water is. So, for example, or to put some numbers around this so that it kind of makes sense, there's an equal number of sodium ions to chloride ions in a sodium an ACl compound. However, chloride makes up 60% of the mass of the compound, and it's mass concentration that we're concerned with when we're trying to quantify our analytes in water. So for example, to make the math simple, if in a water report that you get from the city or online has a sodium concentration reported at a sodium concentration of 40 parts per million or 40 milligrams per liter, you can then assume that you also have a chloride concentration of 60 parts per million because the chloride makes up 60% of the mass of that ion or that compound. So this is useful information, and it's something that I've verified and tested for in a number of municipalities with a number of local water departments. I've done it on 3 or 4 different occasions where I've tested the local water for a customer, called the local water department to get this information, and I've actually talked to the lab representative for the municipality about this, and I've confirmed it numerous times, and also gotten some help from the vendors that I use for testing equipment and verified this. So I hope that's helpful. And if you have any questions about that, of course, bring that up. I tried to do the best job I could explaining that, but it's sometimes these things with chemistry, even for me especially. I mean, I took high school chemistry. I didn't even, I took material science in college, but I don't even remember taking chemistry. So, so that's most of the presentation, and I focus heavily on the testing because I look at it as, for most technicians, we're not all doing water filtration. Some of us are, some of us aren't. Most of us are going to be in front of our customer, and the part that we need to focus on is that having that open communication and dialogue about what's really happening with customers' water. So I tend to emphasize water testing as a way for technicians to have, information that they can either present to a customer or something that they themselves can act on if they're dealing with the filtration themselves. I found that that's been to be the most helpful thing for me in understanding water and solving water problems is really nailing down the testing and understanding what's in my water, so that when I go to make decisions about dealing with it, I'm doing it in the best possible way. So that's basically it. So from that, we're going to transition into some Q&A time, and I'm going to answer some questions with Clinton here. And I hope that you guys got something out of this, and I look forward to in the future the conversations I have with all of you, or with some of you, whoever I get a chance to speak with. And if I can clear anything up, I'd like to, or find the answer. So I also like to thank La Marzocco, my employer, for donating this time so that we can, investigate this important subject. And Clinton?
Beautiful. Well, thank you very much, Scott. We have a few questions lined up, and I see a few more coming in as we go. First thing I wanted to address, you mentioned the Water Quality Handbook from SCA. The full text is a paid book that you can buy, but there is a summarized version available through the SCA's website that has most of the recommended values and stuff like that, and then it gets a little more nitty-gritty science-y for the larger text. First question we had come in was, can desalinated water still have high chlorides?
Yeah, so desalination, at least in municipal water or large water desalination plants, oftentimes will have high chloride concentrations in the product water going out to the city. Primary reason for that is in order to remineralize or increase the TDS somewhat, they're going to blend some of that water back in. Examples, Santa Monica in California is one where most of the water is fed from desal plants right there, but their chloride concentration is still relatively high. So a lot of that comes from blend back or feedback into the water. And they're also desalinating water versus stripping water. RO, municipally treated water with an RO is a little bit different. So yeah.
Okay. Coming from one of those seasonal high chloride areas, most of our water here comes from one of the Great Lakes, so it's not quite as big a swing. But what do you recommend for doing to handle that? Because I don't want to be treating water assuming high chlorides all summer long and doing something that I shouldn't be, and then not catch up come winter time. Is there a way to kind of be ahead of the ball on that?
Well, there's a couple things you can do. One, if your municipal water department has kind of a schedule around that, they probably don't publish it because it's not really important to people, but you can always talk to them and say, hey, what times of the year do you change water sources based upon the season or temperature? So that can be pretty useful. One thing to note about dealing with your local water department that I did not mention is you want to lead in with something like, I really like my water. It tastes really good, but I have some questions as it regards to using in a coffee machine. And the reason why you want to lead in with that is because, well, the only time people really call the water department is if they don't like the water or they think they got sick. So if you lead in out of the gate with how much you love their water, you'll get far and away ahead. And I've done this a number of times where customers have said, I took your advice, I called the water department, they told me to go pound sand. And I will call the same water department, I'll say, who did you talk to? they'll say, I talked to Doug at this number. I will call Doug or email Doug, and they will almost all but one time I have gotten the information and even more information. So it really depends on how you approach these people. So I put that out there. In terms of dealing with seasonability of water, seasonal changes in water though, sometimes, if there's a lot of potential for equipment damage as an equipment technician, and depending upon your relationship with your customer, you're probably going to have to recommend worst case scenario filtration, unfortunately. So that may mean you're going to install an RO with some remineralization, unless this is a customer where you do get to spend more time, you're there fairly frequently, and you can test to verify what's going on with their water and when. And two, you're going to be able to have confidence that either you or the cafe can make those changes to their filter regimen as the water changes seasonally. Now, I can tell you from experience, managing a lot of water filtration systems in cafes across multiple states, that is a lot harder to accomplish than it sounds. So I generally err on the side of caution and say that if you are in an area where your water changes seasonally, and one of those seasons is going to be pretty bad for your equipment, you should probably, plan for the worst, Does that kind of answer it? Does that?
Absolutely. Another one that resonated with me from Scott: can strips survive freezing weather? And testing materials in general. If I forget and leave a bottle of titrant in the car overnight, is it time to throw that out?
That's a good question. And I honestly can't say that I really know the answer to that. I worked for a water filtration company called Eco Water Systems. It's one of the largest manufacturers of water and conditioning equipment in the world. And so I had a number of, testing equipment and titrant reagents in my van. And I live in an area where it does freeze quite a bit in the winter. But I honestly don't. I think I also probably brought most of those things in. They were usually in a separate tool bag or kit that I would carry in. I had a vehicle break-in many years ago and lost all my tools one time. And since then, I became paranoid in the last 15 years. So I don't leave tools in the truck anymore, or I lock them up in the truck. But generally, I bring them in. I just don't leave stuff outside anymore. So,
Might be something to speak to the specific manufacturer of whatever test you're using about the tolerances.
Certainly, yeah. So if you go online and check with Hawk or Hanna or ITS or any of those companies, they should be able to give you a storage range for those. I would think that another consideration would be very hot weather. If you're leaving it out in your van in Phoenix, Arizona, and your van's 120 degrees inside in the parking lot, that might also be a concern too, which I haven't actually had to deal with, but certainly that's something that's worth checking on. So you may have to have some kind of a strategy for managing that.
Continuing talking about testing materials, how consistent is a drop in a titrant? You were talking about accidentally doing 2 drops. There have been times when I've been using the titrants that I use, and it feels like that drop didn't look as big as the last one. I know a drop is supposed to be consistent, but have you seen evidence that says they're a little bit wonky sometimes?
Yes, I have actually. I mean, generally it's relatively consistent, and I think it's sort of, maybe averages out. But I've had that same concern, and that's something I mentioned about with the relative accuracy, But I've had times where I've went to drop it and it looks like 2 drops went in, and so or I'm, often, and for the longest time, I would just, shake it with my hand and drop and shake, and sometimes I just can't walk and chew bubble gum at the same time. I will put out there that I found there's a small, and I should have put a link to it. There's a small battery-powered mag mixer that's only about yay big, and you set the cup in it, you put the water in it, and it spins the stir, and so you're not having to do this, juggle 2 things at once. It makes it a little more manageable. Also makes you look like a pro in front of your customers. You're getting to play a little, chemistry set. So.
writing that one down so I can find it.
Oh, I'll tell you what. I put a link up on the Slack channel. I apologize. I should have put it in this slide deck and I didn't. I can't even remember the name right now, but I have it saved in like one of my Amazon lists. So I'll send you a link.
All right. We'll try to tack that on somehow when this goes up to YouTube too, or through the Facebook or something like that, just so people who aren't on Slack can see it.
Hey, Scott,
a few questions about what's that?
Yeah.
Add it to the deck because we'll post the deck with the actual recording.
Oh, okay, great.
Perfect.
Yeah, we'll do that.
Had a few questions about, we talked about stainless steel quite a bit, but my boiler is made out of copper. Should I be as worried about chlorides? Are they going to interact differently? And differently how, I guess, is the big question, because you've said they would, but.
Yeah, and my understanding of the interactions with chlorides between copper and brass is less so. Most of my career I've been working with stainless steel boilers. This question did come up with a customer recently, and so I did some scant research on it, and because I've also heard this, and from what the takeaway was, what I read in a couple of EPA papers is that chloride, when it attacks stainless steel, it tends to do so at lower pH levels. So if you have no alkaline in your water and your water pH shifts, or you get pitting corrosion, which is the most common type of chloride attack, where you get a small pit, either because there's a defect or a crevice in the metal, or you have two threads together exposed to that water. Or even sometimes where you've got a fair amount of scale in the water and the scale creates a pit. That small cavity in there can create a microenvironment where the pH will drop. And at that point, that's when the chloride becomes active and it will attack, or creates an autocatalytic reaction with your steel at low pH. My understanding and reading, and someone out there probably has a better answer than me, but my limited understanding is that chloride attack on copper and brass, which are more noble metals than stainless steel, tends to occur actually at higher pHs above 8 or 9. That's sort of my limited sort of take on that. So, but it still is possible, but it's less likely than with stainless steel.
And I mean, one thing to factor in is we're talking about espresso machines here. There's a very good chance that there's a batch brewer hooked up to that same water, or water filtered similarly, and that one's going to have a different metal potentially than your copper boiler. So keeping in mind, if we're laser focused on one issue, there might be another issue just down the bar that we've got to keep in mind at the same time. This one's a little longer. We see occasional internal espresso machine damage that looks like the chloride damage on your slide, rusty deposits and stainless eaten away. It always shows up in one group, but not in another, in Marzocco's and some stainless parts and not others. Is this damage caused by greater or less use of the affected group, or why would it attack a certain area?
Well, I guess it would depend upon the number of equipment you have out there and kind of what your, how many pieces of equipment you've looked at. I generally deal with at least for La Marzocco, of course, I'm dealing with each of those cases and all across the U.S. And I can tell you that it's generally not concentrated to one particular group. Let's say always fails. That's generally not true. We see it in all the groups, and I've seen it in different parts of the boiler as well. I know a lot of people point to the weldment, and it is true. You're going to have more susceptibility to chloride attack at weld points, but you can also see it in where you have two pieces threaded together, because that creates a crevice or a pit where you can get that sort of microenvironment that I was talking about. But I've also seen it just burn a hole right through the side, just for whatever reason. You can get a surface pit and it can go right through. I've even seen it go through the side plating on a boiler, like straight through. One thing to note about chloride pitting corrosion is it is an autocatalytic reaction, and there is no way to stop it, essentially. Like once it starts, that's it. You have to cut it out like cancer. So that's why you can't really repair it so much.
Is RO our only option for removing chlorides?
No, and I didn't really talk too much about how to get rid of chlorides, mostly because that would take up even more time, and I think that those those different technologies deserve a little bit more in-depth about what they do and what they don't do. But there are two basic solutions for remediating chloride concentrations: RO and anion exchange. Most people are familiar with cation exchange, which is your traditional water softener. It exchanges sodium or potassium for calcium and magnesium in water to a Bates scale. An anion exchange, and those are cations. Calcium, magnesium, sodium, potassium are all cations. Anything in a compound, in a chemical compound, the first word is your cation, your second word is your anion. So sodium chloride, cation, anion. Has to do with the charges of those particular particles. So anion exchange media works pretty much the same way, although most of the time you don't see an automatic softener type head on there. They're usually a static tank that then has to be recharged off-site. I believe it's like sodium hydroxide or something like that. I'm not as familiar with it because it's not used very much for potable water. It's something that you might see more in a cooling tower or something like that, where they may be likely to use that for various reasons, economics, space, things like that. And there are a lot of other technologies out there and processes for dealing with chlorides in water, but they wouldn't be applicable to a sanitary boiler because unlike those other situations, we're intending to drink the water that comes out of that boiler. So it still needs to be potable water. And that leaves us with those two solutions. So anion exchange, basically, you know, like cation exchange, you're exchanging the chloride in the water for the whatever anion exchanges on that resin bed. But chloride typically isn't your dominant anion in water. It's usually alkalinity. So you're going to be reducing alkalinity in chloride roughly. And I don't have as much direct experience with that. We did some of that when I worked at EcoWater, but it was mostly for industrial. I can also tell you that it's the same principal mechanism that's used in a lot of cartridge-based systems that may remediate chloride. Don't really want to call anyone out by name, but there are some that are advertised as chloride reduction. How well they reduce chloride depends on a number of factors, and if you don't take those factors into account when installing the cartridge, it may be more or less effective. And I can say from other experiences with a few customers that have attempted to employ large media tanks, like these, you know, large glass wrapped tanks that are full of anion exchange media, everyone I've talked to at some point has a failure. The reason is probably that unlike RO, it's a selective form of ion exchange, meaning that you can't just use a TDS meter to determine if the system's working or not. You need to be testing for that specifically for the outgoing chloride concentration to know that the media is being effective. Most people don't know how to test or aren't testing for chloride, and that's why we're here. So I'll just put that out there. RO, on the other hand, is a non-selective form of TDS removal, also known as desalination, and it's highly effective at removing chlorides from water. The other advantages are it's highly predictable, meaning that RO systems, when installed and maintained properly, work for years and years and years, and generally you have a pretty, you know, high expectation of the results you're going to get. So I will leave that out there. So.
And we'll actually tack onto that one for job sites with blending RO units. So those are ones that are using the original water concentration, ROing some of it and then blending a little back in. Which is more important, being spec for max chloride or minimum TDS?
So remember, when you're blending water back in, you're diluting it. So you're diluting pure water with some of the source RO water. And in some certain situations, you can do blending with high chlorides. Relatively high chlorides. I'd say 50 parts per million or less, and you can do blend back because you're just going to dilute that chloride down to a safe level. The challenge in that, though, is that oftentimes your chloride concentration can vary, and so you need to keep track of it. So again, you're going to be back to testing, and you're probably going to be testing specifically for chloride. The situation which comes most to mind is going to be Los Angeles, where the water quality varies radically because there are a number of different water sources being fed into this very large system or interconnected system. So your chloride concentration one month might be relatively low and it might be really high the next month. It really really moves around. So in situations like that, you have to be very diligent when using a blending system to maintain those low chloride levels. So in those situations, I usually say, based upon my experience and somewhat understanding of human nature in this, is that you're better off, instead of playing chemistry, just finding a solution that works all year round, and generally remineralization will work for that.
Beautiful. Have one more, looks like it's halfway between a comment and a question to me. I like it. Eco modes, which power down to 70 or 80 degrees. Will this help to keep chlorides from eating the boiler? Also, with water moving through the machine during service, does that help or hurt compared to water sitting stagnant overnight? Is that fresh supply of water helping us better or hurting us? And if we're lowering the temperature, is that going to speed or slow things down a little bit?
You know, I think that when thinking about that, we're introducing a number of variables which are somewhat harder to quantify in terms of result. We haven't tested it that way. And I would point out that anytime you leave a corrosion vector in your water, you're leaving a risk, right? You're putting your equipment at risk. So you really have to balance that out. It's like, well, why would I want to do that? I don't know that it would improve resistance to chloride attack by lowering the temperature. But I would probably err on the side of caution and assume that it probably doesn't.
All right. Trying to see if there's any more in here. One thing I will note here, and from personal experience, I can say it's happened to me too. Autocorrect seems to have changed Highland's name and email on this slide of the deck. There's no D after Highland. So if you're trying to email Highland for the deck, go with, it's happened to me more than a few times. You can hear how Siri spells it. It's impressive.
You guys are really hurting my feelings.
And I've emailed you a few times, and it's done that to me in my own, and I've already been emailed you, so I'm like, why is it doing that? Either in the address itself, and then you never respond, and I think you're just ignoring me, or I address you like that in the email body. So
it's okay. For a long time, I'd email you, and I'd never hear back, and I'm like, God damn, Scott. And then I realized I was emailing Scott G.
Oh, yeah.
Marty had a question I want to get to, then I have two questions. Marty's row, his question is, so we tested, results are that we have too many chlorides. Can you give a couple quick options that to mitigate? I know we're gonna talk about doing this for Ask the Expert Pro series, but can you give like some ideas of what we need to look for?
Clarify that for me.
Sorry. Marty's asking for mitigation, and mitigation is an entire episode, but anything that you can quickly go over?
Yeah, RO. And
right.
anion exchange, but I'm not a fan of anion exchange only because I've seen it fail for people.
Right.
RO is pretty straightforward.
Okay, and then when you're a tech going into a job, you got a lot on your mind. How much of this should you be paying attention to?
Well, from my own experience, because I came into this being held responsible for a bunch of Starbucks stores at one time. And it costing a lot of money. I, at some point decided I'm going to incorporate some form of water testing into every service visit that I'm there at. It's either reactive or it's going to be preventative maintenance, but either way, it's going to be on my work order form or somewhere where I have to fill that out so that every time I'm doing it, and I just make it a practice. That may not be the same testing regimen for every place because it's going to be dependent upon where it's located. And then over time, of course, you're gonna as you're testing more and more and more, you're gonna you get human beings, we're geared towards pattern recognition. You're gonna notice that I've been here a bunch of times, the water's usually hard, the water's usually soft. You'll test it again, but you have some expectation. But either way, incorporate that into what you're doing and start now and just do it and make it a habit.
Excellent. Clint, I'm going to let you wrap it up. I'm going to jump off.
Beautiful. one more question that I just thought was interesting, and I'd like to get a quick answer for, because I think it's a quick one. In a steam boiler with evaporation, are chlorides concentrating there, or are they working their way out with the steam?
Nope, they're a solid, so they're concentrating in there. However, you're concentrating everything else. So we tend to see less pitting corrosion in a steam boiler as a result than in a coffee boiler. So you're kind of altering the chemistry, but by concentrating it, but it tends to, you're less likely to drift into that range that it's going to corrode. So
beautiful. Well, I think that gets just about everybody. We're going to have a copy of the questions to review after, so if there's anything we missed, we'll make sure that those are answered in text form, either on the deck sent out or through social media. But I'd like to thank everybody for coming to attending this talk. I'd like to thank Scott for giving this talk. I've got a whole pile of notes over here to keep following up and learning, and I appreciate that that's always the case when you speak to us. And thanks to SCA and the Coffee Tech Guild for keeping these conversations going. Please join us next Friday.
thanks, everybody. Thanks, Glenn. Thanks, Highland.
Bye, gents. Have a good weekend.
You too. Have a great weekend, everyone.